So I'll start out with a while loop real quick, just to give you an example of a while loop. So let me zoom in on this a little bit so you can see it. So we'll do, I'm just going to call it int I equals 1. And I'm going to say while I is less than 5, less than or equal to 5. And again, when we do these while loops, the for loop, any kind of loop, we use our keyword to start it out. We got a while loop here, so we'll use the keyword while. If we're going to do a for loop, we'd have it say for. Follow the keyword with a parenthesis, and then whatever your condition is that you're going to loop through it, we're going to say loop through it until this I is less than or equal to 5. Keep looping through it. We're setting our I at 1. So then we follow it with the squiggly brackets, and we'll do a console.writeLine. And I'm going to do it old school way instead of doing a string interpolation at this point. C# for loop iteration. So this is, I call it the old school way of doing it. You can put your string in here like that. Your variable is going to go inside the squigglies again like we've been doing with the string interpolation. But as we set this placeholder at 0, we got to define what we're putting in that placeholder, and that's what this I is doing here. It's going to pick up the values off our loop, our index, and go ahead and put it in there. And then each time through, we'll increase I. So now if I run this, we should have some printouts of 1 through 5 with our text saying C for loop, iteration, and then the number of iterations. So let's run this. And then you can see C for loop, iteration 1. Since we start at 1, our I is set at 1. We set our value of I at 1 here, and so all we do is where the I is, we plug that 1 in where that I goes. Since we gave it the value of 1, that's how you can kind of think of it as. So this I holds the value of 1. We're just plugging this 1 down in here for the most part. We say while 1 is less than or equal to 5, print this out. Take our placeholder, replace it whatever that value of I is, and of course we just said I is 1, so that first one is going to be a 1. Where'd my thing go? So you can see our value of 1 shows up there. After it prints that out, it increases our I by 1, so our I then goes to 2. So you can look at it and say, while I, which we just increased from 1 to 2, 2 is less than or equal to 5. Yes, that's true. So let's go down here and run our code again. And that's why we get this second line, iteration 2. It runs that. It hits the I++ again. And again, that increments our I. So then the I goes from 2 to 3. And it just keeps running until our I hits 5. 5 is equal. So then it drops down, does the fifth one, increments it to 6. Well, 6 is not less than or equal to 5, so then it quits running our loop. So that's a quick while loop there. So now we'll do one where it's going to sum up some numbers for us. So I'll leave this kind of like it is. I'm going to use another int called sum. Set the value of it to 0. And we'll keep that while I is less than or equal to 5, but instead of this console.writeLine being here, we're going to do sum plus equal I. We'll increment the I after that, and then outside our while loop, we'll do console.writeLine. And if I want to do string interpolation this time, instead of the old school way, I would do $, quotation, sum equals, and then we'll just do sum. Close my quote. So now what we're looking at is we're setting I to 1. It checks our while loop and says, is 1 less than or equal to 5? Yep. Go take the sum, which we set at 0, and add I into it. So our sum will go from 0 to 1. We increment our I. It'll go back up through our loop. Our I will go to 2. 2 is less than or equal to 5. Yep. Take that 2 and add it to our sum. The sum is going to be holding that value of 1, so then our sum will total 3 after it runs through the second time. It'll increase I and keep running through like that. So let's run this and see what we end up with. Our sum is 15. So we take 1 plus 2 is 3. 2 plus 3 is 5. 5 plus 4 is 9, and 9 plus 5, I think that's something like that. My math isn't very good, but that's what we're doing there, is just taking 1 plus 2, 3. 3 plus 3 is 6, that's what it is. 3 plus 3 is 6. 6 plus 4 is 10, and 10 plus 5 is 15. So, never claimed to be a math major, but that's how we get the sum of 15. Does that make sense to everybody, how that works? That makes sense to you, Liam? Oh, put the phone down and it might make a little more sense.
I was paying attention. I was just talking about
All right, just making sure. All right, I want to make sure you understand these for loops because it seems like some people are struggling with them.
Is I an optional way to put
Yep, if we want to, we could call it Z.
Name it anything?
You could call it whatever you want. Usually you just use one letter and it's always I for like an index kind of a thing. So now we can call it Z. If we run it again, we'll still get our sum is 15. I can call it L for Liam if I want. And then if you use a nested for loop, you have to make sure your variables are 2 different ones. I think in our multiplication table they used I and J. That seems like the most common ones you see used is I and J if you're using a nested loop. So there's a loop where we add some stuff up. We can do a do while loop. So we'll take a look at a do while loop here real quick. So I'll leave that int L up there for Liam. So do it n equals 5, and then we'll call the product. And again, my product is squiggly green. If you hover over it, it says it's declared but never used. That means it's kind of a wasted piece of code until you actually use it. Like I said, when I worked for the Department of Defense, we ran a program that checked for stuff like that. And if it wasn't being used, they made us take it out because there is a chance it could be hacked. So if you end up declaring a bunch of variables and don't using them, you might want to get in the habit of taking them out or making sure you are using them if you're declaring them. So I'll do product equals n times I. And then I'll put a console.write line right under that. I'm just going to cut this one out of here since it's already kind of sitting here and I don't need it there. I got to change my wording up. I'll go back old school this time again. I don't like doing this. It's a lot easier using string interpolation, but what's that?
Your do statement is not overlaying with brackets.
Yeah, I got stuff going different here, so there, that cleans that up. I called it int first, not thinking about it. Then I forgot I switched to an L instead of I, so I had to switch my L down here to make sure it matched. Let me get my rest of my code looking clean down here. So I'm going to take 0 times 1, which equals 2. And then I'm doing N, L, and N, N, L, and product. I close my parenthesis. That should take care of that. I'm going to increment my I. Oh, it's actually L. I keep saying I. I'm so used to it being I. And so I got a squiggly down here. It's saying I got a do loop. I got to do something with this do loop. And so we put a while down here, and we're going to say while L is less than or equal to 10. So this should loop through 10 times now. So what we're saying here is do, and you run through here one time, and then you check your while condition. If the while condition is true, it'll keep going back through your do loop. If the while condition is false, then it will break and get you out of there. So what we're saying is take N, which is 5, so we're taking 5 times L, which we're starting at 1, and we're going to take 5 times 1, run through here, print it out, and then take 5 times 2 as we keep looping through here and adding to our loop. And so we should get up from 5 times 1 to 5 times 10, and it print everyone out. So we'll run that and take a look. So there it is. We got, of course, our N. We give it the value of 5 up here when we declare it. We give it the value of 5, so we know this N is always going to be 5. If you wanted to, you could just put the 5 in there instead, but this is a good programming way of doing it.
So once L like reaches, once L reaches like once the product like reaches 10, it should stop the while loop.
Once our L reaches 10, because if you look in that while loop, that's what we're comparing down there, is we're counting this L up. We keep incrementing L each time we run through. Once this L is greater than 10, because if it's equal, it'll still run, but once it becomes greater than 10, then it stops doing our loop. So we're saying as long as L is less than or equal to 10, and we know 1 through 9 is less than 10, 10 equals 10, so it does, that's why it does 10. But once L hits 11, L is greater than 10, so it stops running our loop. So there's a do loop. Do it hits the do, it will run through at least one time on a do while loop. And then as it runs through, it checks the condition of our while, and as long as it's true, it'll keep going. Once it becomes false, and it becomes false once that L hits 11, and then it will go ahead and stop and get out of the loop and do what it needs to do. So now if we run an infinite loop, and I've seen some people do this because they've been using ChatGPT to try and get their work for them. We can do a do while and just set this as true. And we'll just do a console.writeLine. Hello world. Take this out. Don't need any of that or that. So now when we run this, it should just keep printing us hello world over and over and over and over again if it works right. And there you can see if I drag my slider up, all the hello worlds it keeps printing. And like if you, right when I start, if you watch, you'll see that slider just drop because this is an infinite loop. There's no way to break out of it, and that's why we have to do that in the whiles. Like if the salesperson's initial does not equal Z, if the salesperson or the grade is 999, that's what we got to use to break out of these loops. If not, it's just going to keep running and running and running. And that's all this is doing. This is still printing hello world out while I'm talking. You just can't see it because it's doing so many times. So if I actually, I don't think I'll be able to get it over fast enough to see it. So if I start this, and you kind of watch on that right hand side, you'll see the slider drop really fast. And there you can see it going down because it was keep printing all that hello world. That's an infinite loop. That's something you want to try and avoid because you can see my cursor's flashing down here at the bottom because it's still printing hello world out constantly as I talk. That's an infinite loop. Can't get out of them. It just keeps running code like that nonstop. That's something as a programmer you want to try and avoid, is an infinite loop. And that's why on these do whiles and stuff like that, we give the users a way to break out of them by either putting, I know Z, I think it was on one, 999 broke one of them, but that's how you have to get out of these infinite loops, is giving the user some way of breaking it to get out. So that's some of those. Let me check a couple more that I got here. I had some pretty good examples. So I'll give you an example of a for loop. This for loop's gonna repeat 5 times. And so IntelliSense is trying to put args.length in there for us. That args is coming from up here in this parameter that we're passing through from this main, but of course IntelliSense doesn't always know what we want, so you got to kind of be aware of that. We're going to do a less than 5 since we wanted to do it 5 times. And then we always want it to increment or decrement afterwards. So here we're initializing it here. That's called initializing our for loop. This is the termination of our for loop. We terminate it when it hits the condition that we're checking. And then of course we increment it or decrement it depending on what you're doing. Most of the time you're going to be incrementing a loop. You decrement it if you're counting backwards or counting down. We're counting up in most of these, so I'm going to do a console.writeLine. I'm going to have it say clap your hands. You don't necessarily have to clap your hands. My daughter at home would love this. When she hears Old MacDonald or bingo played on TV, she starts clapping her hands right away because that's what you do with it. So now we're just going to run through this for loop. We're saying, declaring an integer, naming it I, giving it the value of 0. We're saying I is less than 5. Well, we know it's less than 5 because we just said it's 0. Run through our loop, come back up here, and then increment it 1 time. And then, like I said, this integer I, Liam, can be any letter you want it to be. If you wanted to give it a name, you could do that. But in most cases, everybody just uses an I. So if I run this, it should print out clap your hands 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can always debug this to kind of see how it works. Let's debug it real quick so you can get an example of that. So we start out in our loop. We're initializing our iterator. Step over it. We do our termination check here. Is I less than 5? Yes, we know it is because we just set it to 0. Goes into our for loop. It does our console.writeLine. Finishes the for loop, comes back up and it increments I. If we look down here, I was at 0. Once we hit this again, I switches to 1 because we just incremented it. Goes back through our loop again. Checks is I less than 5? Yes, it is, because we see it down here. I is 1. Go write our line again, and you can see we've gone through it twice now. It's printed 2 times. We keep going through. It's going to increment it to 2. You can see the value is 2 here. We should be able to hover over it and see I is also 2 up here. I is 2. We run it again, and I'll see if I can keep this up. Probably not. Slide this over a little bit. As we walk through, we're checking it. We're getting ready to go in our for loop to print it again. And I lost my little arrows to step through. One more a little bit. There we go. So now as we step through and hit it again, our I is set at 2. We're going to run it for the 3rd time. There's our console.write line, and you can see our 3rd one just popped up on the console. It's going to increment I again. Look down here, and I is set at 3. So you can always debug these for loops to kind of see what it's doing and help count through what's going on with it. It's not too hard to do. So now we'll use one with an array, since we've been working with arrays. Let me scroll that back over so I can get my code clean. So I'm going to create an integer array. How do we create an integer array? What do we need after the int?
Square brackets.
Square brackets, yep, to show that it's an array. Next part of it is naming the array.
Yes, class my array.
Yep. And we'll do a new int. We need the square brackets again. And we don't have a size in there. You don't always need a size, but we have been setting the sizes on them. 7, 2, and 4. I'll close that. Semicolon. Then I can do a for loop here. 4. And again, right after the keyword for, we put our parentheses. After the parentheses, we put squiggly brackets. If you have a problem remembering the squiggly brackets in that, I would set it up like this first, just to get it prepared, because this is usually the body of a for loop. Then you can go back into parentheses and put your initializer and all your check and all that in there. So I'll say int L for Liam again, equals 0. I is less than, and how do we check the size of an array when we do a for loop?
Array.length.
Yep, the array name dot length, my array dot length, and then we increment our I again, and that keeps wanting to put, oh, I put it at L, no wonder it keeps switching on me. So used to I. So then we'll have the console.write line, and we'll just have it print out the values of the array. So we should have 724 print out for us. And there it is, 724. So what we're saying here is our int, declare an integer, give it the name of L, a value of 0. We're saying if L is less than the length of my array, and we could put a 3 in here if we wanted to, since it's only 3. That way the array length knows it's 3. It can get the values here, see that it's 3. Come down here and write the first index of the array, which is at 7, and it starts at 0, so we pick up the 0 one first. We put this at 1, we should only get 2 and 4 when we run this now, so let's see if that's true. and we only get 2 or 4 because we're starting at index 1, which is the number 2, the value of 2, instead of 0. 0 is the value 7. So if we did 2 here and run it, we should only pick up the 4 now at this point. And there's the 4. If we put this at 3, what do you think's going to happen? Anybody? It's probably going to break because we're trying to go over. Or it didn't break, it just, there's nothing to it. It didn't find anything, so that's what happens if you set your for loop greater than the amount of values in your index in your array.
I guess right now it's supposed to be 0.
Yep. So that's why when we start our for loop at 0, it picks up all 3 numbers because we're starting at 0 is the very first index in our array. So that 0 is the value of 7. The first one is 2 and the second one is 4. So you got to kind of keep that in mind when you work with arrays. And then the same way we can do a for each loop for this. I'll just change it like this, for each. And then for the for each, we give it a value we want. We'll just say int number in my array. And now that we're not using the index off of it, because this for each will walk through each index in this array, we can just get rid of that. And as we do it, this number is what we're checking now. We're checking each number in our array. So each value in our array, we're going to spit that out to the screen. So now we should still have 724. And there's that 724 again. So the for each, you define a variable type, and since our array is an int, we're sticking with an int for it. And then the variable is assigned, create a variable and assign it and have it pass through the array. We just spit out that variable that we created, and that gets all of our numbers and prints them out. So here we'll do another while loop. Get rid of that. So I'll call int number of trees equals 0. I'm going to do a while loop and say while, and again for a loop or anything like the if statement, after your keyword you put your parentheses. So we'll do parentheses first, and then it's always followed by squiggly brackets. And so I'll put my parentheses and my squiggly brackets down, so that way I don't mess up my squiggly bracket count. Because once you miss one of these, you get all kinds of errors. You can see down here it's expecting one, and you kind of got to dig through to see where it's at. Luckily, Visual Studio puts these dotted lines underneath so you can kind of see how they match up. So you have an opening and a closing, they should match. You can usually click on them too, and it'll highlight them in blue to show which ones match up with each other. My squiggly's mad because I don't have anything inside of it, or my parentheses mad because I don't have anything inside of it. So let's do while number of trees is less than 10. We'll do number of trees plus equal 1. Console dot write line, and we'll have it say I planted And then we'll do string interpolation here, or not interpolation, we'll do concatenation here. See, we haven't used it too much. Like I said, I like string interpolation. So now while the number of trees is less than 10, keep looping through here, add 1 to our number of trees. Of course, we set number of trees to 0, so number of trees set to 0. That's going to be 0 is less than 10. So we'll loop through here, and we should have 1 through 10 trees. And then I will do this, just console.writeLine. I have a forest. So now it should loop through, right? I planted whatever number of trees, and at the very end it should print out I have a forest. So let's run this. And there I planted 1 tree, 2 trees, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then it finishes. And there's my last one. I planted a forest. So if we set this at 1 and run through here, let's see what we get. Of course, it starts at 2 because we set our number of trees at 1. Our number of trees here picks up the value 1 and then adds 1 to it. So we start out at 2 instead of 1 on that. So that's something you got to keep in mind when you're trying to print stuff out, is where you need to start your initialization of your count. For our trees, we set it at 0 and it picks up the 1 and runs through. If we set it at 1, it starts at 2. And another infinite loop example here is we can do, we'll do a Boolean value. The sun is up, and that's going to equal true. And then we'll say while the sun is up, console.writeLine, stay awake forever, since it's an infinite loop. And then if we put after our loop, we can do another console.writeLine and put go to sleep. But what's the problem with that? Because the sun is up is always true, and this while loop is always true, it's just going to continually print this. It'll never make it down into this go to sleep, because we don't have anything to break it and get it out of that while loop. Because this while is always true, it's just going to keep running through here and never make it out of that loop to come down to this last line. So let's run that, and you can see there, stay awake. My cursor down here keeps blinking because it's continuously printing out stay awake forever. I just drag my slider up, and you can see it's just constantly printing it out. My cursor is blinking down there again because it's continuously printing out stay awake forever. So as a developer, that's something you got to watch out for, is these infinite loops. Got to find a way to break out of them. We put a break statement in here, we'll see what happens. So this should break out after one loop. Let's see. And again, we put that break statement in there. It says hit this break, break out of the loop. So it only goes into it the one time. We get that stay awake forever. And because we hit that break, it breaks out and then hits that go to sleep. So there's certain things you can do to get out of a loop. You can set conditions to get out of them, and we've been doing some of those with that do while or the while salesperson's name doesn't equal Z, that kind of stuff like that. That helps us get out of those. And that infinite loop is something as a developer you want to stay away from if possible. Another example of a do while loop. So I'll say int push up goal for all you health nuts equals 10. And we'll do a do console.writeLine push up goal. We'll do a minus equal 1 this time. While push up goal, and we're going to say is greater than 0. So now what we should do is we'll come in here once, we start our push-ups at 10, our push-up goal. Once we go through it once, we subtract 1. Our push-up goal is greater than 0, go back through it. But we know it starts at 10, it's going to decrement it, take 1 away from our 10 each time it hits this line. So then we'll do 10, and then it'll hit 9 and keep going down. As soon as our push-ups hit 0, our 0 is no longer greater than 0, and that's going to get us out of this loop. Let's see what we got when we run this. Push up, push up, push up, push up, all the way down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's what we expect since our push-ups were at 10 and we're counting them down to 0. And this while here allows us to break out of it, because we set it to where our push-ups, when they equal 0, that's all. So instead of a do loop, we could do a while loop for the same thing and say while push-up goal is greater than 0, console.writeLine push up and do push-up goal minus equal 1. Now we run that, we should get the same thing as what we had. And we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that was an example of using the same thing as a do while loop and just a while loop. So like I said, when you do the while loop, it runs through it. The do while runs through at least once before it would stop. This one checks first before it runs through. So if we can do a console.writeLine you're too weak. So if we set our push-up goal to 0, it's checking to see if push-up goal is greater than 0 and run through here. Well, now that we set our push-up goal to 0, our push-up goal 0 is not going to be greater than 0, so we should drop down here and get the you're too weak message. And there it is, you're too weak. And that's because we set our push-up goal to 0. 0 is not greater than 0. Set it to 1. We got 1 push-up done. and got told you're too weak. So that's a while loop compared to a do while. We briefly took a look at the break statement. Let's take a look at the continue statement real quick. Continue statement just says skip part of the sequence and continue on. So we'll do a for loop for int I is 0, I is less than 10, increment I, and then we'll say if I is equal to 2 or I is equal to 5. And why are we using the 2 equal signs and not a 1 equal sign?
And one would assign it.
Yeah, 1 assigns the value of it, 2 is actually comparing it. If we use 3, 3 checks the variable number and the data type that you use against it. You occasionally see 3 equal signs used, but it's more often than just you'll see the 2 for the comparison of just the values instead of the data types with it. So if that's equal to 5, we'll continue. So once we hit 2 or 5, this won't continue, this won't print out. So let's do a console.write line. Let's see how that works. So we get 2 hellos. So we start int at I is less than 10, increment I, if I equals 2 or I equals 5, continue on. We get the 2 and then it continues. Let's take a break here and we'll keep going through some more. I'll do another, I'll loop through an array again when you guys come back. We'll take about a 15-minute break and pick some more of this up.